Good evening and welcome to the New York Society Library Louder. I'm Sarah Holliday, Library Events Coordinator, and I'm really thrilled to see so many of you turn out on a still rather cold night for what I'm sure will be a wonderful lecture on Franklin and Eleanor. I'm just standing here to remind you first that all our events are supported and helped out by donations from our wonderful membership. And if you're interested in underwriting or generally supporting events and our other activities, you're welcome to speak to our development staff. We do have a continuing, really excellent season, if I do say so myself, of events coming up. And you can pick up a January newsletter at the front desk, which will list things for the rest of the spring. And also, I just heard somebody doing in advance what I was about to say. Please silence all electronic devices. Our last couple of events have been fantastic, except they've both been disrupted by electronic devices. And please don't let that happen this time. We'd appreciate it. Turn off your cell phone. Thanks. All right. And now I'll turn the podium over to Ellen Feldman, who will introduce our speaker. Thank you.
Good evening. Is that loud enough? No. Okay. Good evening. It is a great honor to introduce the acclaimed biographer, Hazel Rowley. It's also my great pleasure to introduce my friend, Hazel Rowley. Hazel burst upon the scene, and I mean that literally, in 1993 with her dazzling biography, Christina's Stead, a biography. This was her first book, and it won the Australian National Book Award for the year for nonfiction and was named a New York Times Notable Book of the Year. In 2007, that book was reissued. Her next book was Richard Wright, The Life and Times, which she wrote while affiliated with Harvard's W.E.B. Du Bois Institute for African American Studies. This book garnered glowing reviews from the New York Times, the Washington Post, and just about every other paper and journal, and was one of the Washington Post Book World raves for the year. It was reissued by the Chicago University Press in 2008. Now you see a pattern building here. Hazel's books have staying power. They're really, or another jargon, they have legs. They really stay with you. And people keep reading them. After Harvard, Hazel moved to Paris for 18 months to write Tête-à-Tête, The Tumultuous Lives and Loves of Simone de Beauvoir and Jean-Paul Sartre, a stunning dual biography of a complicated, to say the least, couple. The book was published here in 2005, translated into more than a dozen languages, and garnered considerable international acclaim and controversy. On that subject, I recommend Hazel's essay on the censorship she endured in France while working on this book and trying to publish this book. It's on her website. Tête-à-Tête was named the best book of 2005 by the Washington Post and the best literary essay of 2006 by the French literary magazine Lire. Hazel has published articles in Partisan Review, the Times Literary Supplement, the Boston Globe, the Washington Post, the Nation, the LA Times, and too many other respected papers and journals for me to list if you're going to hear her speak. She was born in England and raised there and in Australia and now lives in New York City. Now, a few words about this book. When I first met Hazel, she was beginning work on Franklin and Eleanor. And I asked her, we met because of this, I asked her what she was working on. She said Franklin and Eleanor. And I thought, my God, what is this woman thinking? Do we really need another book about this couple that have been so well chronicled? And needless to say, I didn't say that to her. And then I read the manuscript, and I found out, yes, we did need another book. Hazel is the first one to write about this marriage, this endlessly fascinating marriage and political partnership, not as a troubled relationship, which is the way most historians and biographers have seen it, but as a deep, tender, and supportive union. It not only sustained FDR and ER, but included a wide circle of friends in its warmth and helped shape the nation and the world in the 20th century. But don't take my word for this. Here are some of the raves about Franklin and Eleanor, An Extraordinary Marriage. Crackling. Rowley has chronicled out-of-the-box relationships before. Her last book was the highly acclaimed biography of the partnership between Jean-Paul Sartre and Simone de Beauvoir. Nothing against the French, but there's no contest here. While Sartre and de Beauvoir were hashing over gender roles in sequestered cafes, Franklin and Eleanor had already forged their own cutting-edge version of a marriage, despite living for nearly 4 terms in the fishbowl of the White House, Maureen Corrigan, Fresh Air, and National Public Radio. This enticing new biography reads more like a wonderful novel. This is much more than a book about politics. The Washington Post. Sensitive, hugely compelling, Vogue. If you are going to read only one book about this extraordinary couple, this is the one, The Washington Times. Hypnotically readable, and inclusive vivacity and psychological tact that reminds one of Velázquez. Now, how many biographers have been compared to an old master? That's really incredible. I could go on with these quotes, but I think you'd rather hear from Hazel herself. So here is Hazel and Franklin and Eleanor, An Extraordinary Marriage.
Thank you. Ellen, is it loud enough? No. Can we turn it up? Because I really don't like to shout. What if I turn it up to high? No? No mucking around? Is this better? Yes. Okay. Well, that was a most beautiful introduction. Thank you, Ellen, who is a wonderful, generous friend and has been. This is her book, Lucy, which I read when I was up at the FDR archives, which are wonderful archives, but it's a little grim being up there in those motels after the library closes. And to read this book cheered me up a great deal. In fact, I found myself wanting to write that way because being a novelist, she can really do viewpoint stuff, which a biographer can never do. She got right into the character of the enigmatic Lucy Mercer, who I'll talk about. Among other things tonight, we ended up having a very different view about Lucy, but that doesn't make her book any less admirable. I found it extraordinary. So, and thank you very much for the New York Society Library for inviting me here tonight, and thank you very much for coming, all of you. Last night I spoke at Roosevelt House at a Valentine dinner, and I managed to convince them that this was a real love affair. That was the point. And so I hope I convince you. What I realized when I went up, this book began when I went up to the FDR library at Hyde Park, and soon after I'd moved to New York, and everybody was asking the guide about the relationship and rather negative questions. You know, is it true that Eleanor was really a lesbian? Is it true that Franklin really was in love with another woman? It was really just a public facade, wasn't it? And what I came away thinking was, I will look at this marriage because apparently it had been 40 years since there had been a book on the subject by Joseph Lash, and I was open to what I would find. But my premise from the very beginning was that this couldn't be right. I mean, what are our criteria for a good marriage, really? I mean, how many of us deal with our partner coming down with polio at the age of 39, 16 years into the marriage? And I mean, if you can think how devastating that was. And they not only came back, Franklin came back to life as president of the US at the age of 50. So my question to myself is, how was it possible for this man who come from this very sheltered aristocratic Hyde Park upbringing with his mother doting on him, and who came down with polio at the age of 39, how was it possible for him to become president of the US at the age of 50? And I thought that it clearly had a lot to do with Eleanor, and the more I immersed myself in the documents, the more I found that indeed it absolutely did. And what made it possible for Eleanor, who was 5'11", Franklin was 6'1", I hope it comes across that they're tall. And she always felt like an ugly duckling. Her mother, who died when Eleanor was 8, really rather rejected her because of her lack of beauty. Eleanor sensed that as a very young girl. And then her mother died when she was 8, and her father died of alcoholism when she was 10. She was an orphan. She had to live with her grandmother. She always felt she had to be good to deserve love. In fact, even in the White House, she felt like that. But so what made it possible for Eleanor to go from that timid, insecure background, coming from the most prominent Republican family in America? Remember, her uncle, her dead father's brother, was Theodore Roosevelt, the Republican president. What made it possible for her to go from there to being the most progressive, outspoken, democratic, courageous First Lady this country has ever known? And clearly it had an enormous amount to do with Franklin. So most of the biographies take sides. Some see Franklin as the long-suffering partner, while others claim it was Eleanor. But they nearly always do, and I read an article in the New Yorker just recently, which did. The prevailing myth is that it was not a good marriage. Nearly all see the marriage as a kind of tragic compromise patched together by two lonely people. I find this a strangely condescending interpretation of the bold and radical partnership that has made Franklin and Eleanor go down in history as one of the most powerful and inspiring couples of all times. So in this short talk, I hope to give you some ideas of the turning points that gradually made it the bold and radical marriage it became, and to give you a sense of the generosity that was at the heart of it. Then I hope we'll have an animated discussion, the kind the Roosevelts used to enjoy at their dinner table. It started out as an utterly conventional marriage between aristocrats. This was the Victorian era. High society in New York was hidebound, much more so than in Europe, as Eleanor found when she went to England to finishing school for 3 years. And Franklin and Eleanor were even more constrained than most young couples, since they lived under the thumb of Franklin's dominating mother, Sarah. So, for Eleanor, Franklin did what was almost impossible for Franklin. He told his mother that he wanted to marry Eleanor, and she became extremely tight-lipped. And then he wrote her a letter after that, and he says this: "Dearest Mamma, I know what pain I must have caused you, and you know I wouldn't do it if I really could have helped it. Mais tu sais, me voilà." But you know, that's me. That's all that could be said. I know my mind, have known it for a long time, and I know that I could never think otherwise. Result, I'm the happiest man just now in the world, likewise the luckiest. So he wrote to dear Mummy that she will be gaining a daughter. And a few days later, Eleanor wrote a rather more pathetic letter, poor orphan Eleanor. Dearest cousin Sally, that's what Sarah was known in the family as Sally. I know just how you feel and how hard it must be, but I do so want you to learn to love me a little. It is impossible for me to tell you how I feel towards Franklin. I can only say that my one great wish is always to prove worthy of him. Well, she sure did that. So I find the early photos, for those who say it was not a love marriage, very playful. Here they are in Campobello. Here's Eleanor. No photographers came to the wedding. She's in a studio here. Here they are with Franklin holding Eleanor's knitting and she holding his glass. She almost never drank alcohol. She came from an entire family of alcoholics, her brother, her father, her uncles. She didn't find prohibition cocktails as amusing as Franklin did. Sarah Roosevelt had always been a domineering presence in Franklin's life, and she made sure this continued after his marriage. You see how Victorian they were. This is 10 years into the 1910, 5 years into the marriage, on Campobello Beach. She's still wearing a long dress, and Franklin's snuggling up to her. Widowed at 46, Sarah Roosevelt possessed a vast fortune, her father's money and her husband's money. James Roosevelt was Franklin's father, and he'd left Franklin a very small trust fund. And so from the age of 46, she possessed this vast fortune, and yet throughout her long life, and she died just 3 years before Franklin, even when her son was president of the US, she only ever gave Franklin money in the form of handouts. As a Christmas present the year Franklin and Eleanor married, Mama, as Franklin and Eleanor both called her, had a house built for them, a handsome neo-Georgian double townhouse on East 65th Street. The catch, half the house was to be occupied by Mama. The first years of the marriage were not particularly happy. Franklin worked as a lawyer, which he didn't much like. Eleanor had 4 babies in 5.5 years, which she didn't much like. And Mama was constantly bustling through the connecting doors between the twin houses, which she liked, but Eleanor didn't. And then 5 years into the marriage, in 1910, Franklin and Eleanor took their first bold step away from tradition. As you know, the American aristocracy traditionally voted Republican. Franklin, like his father before him, saw himself as a Democrat. But because Theodore Roosevelt was a progressive Republican, Franklin, he believed in government regulation of big business and workers' compensation and women's suffrage and social insurance, a Republican, unlike many today. Franklin had no qualms about casting his first vote for his cousin. Why didn't Eleanor cast her first vote for her uncle? Women did not have the vote until 1920. But when Theodore Roosevelt's presidency ended, Franklin ran as a Democratic candidate in the New York State Senate. He was just 28, and he was running in the solidly Republican Hudson Valley farming district where he grew up. No one thought he had a chance, and he won the seat. So they went for 3 years to Albany. And 3 important things happened in Albany. Franklin got himself on the national map as something of a hero who stood up to Tammany Hall and its corruption. Chain smoking, very intense, small journalist came round to the house and interviewed Franklin and went home and told his wife that he had met the man who he was quite sure would one day be President of the United States. That was Louis Howe, who is a really wonderful personality in my book and admirable fellow, devoted. Finally, Eleanor became interested in politics. And even though she denies it in her autobiography, we don't have to believe her. From Albany onwards, she was interested in politics. She was thrilled by it. Friends remarked that in the Albany years, Franklin and Eleanor looked much happier and more confident than before. There was also a stretch of road between them and Mama. In March 1913, Franklin, at the age of 31, landed the prestigious post of Assistant Secretary of the Navy. The family moved to Washington. Louis Howe, who'd become a close friend of Franklin's, was proving to be a brilliant political strategist, and Franklin employed him as his assistant. From now on, Louis Howe was Franklin's assistant. Eleanor went to extraordinary lengths to help Franklin in his job, braving seasickness. She called it feeding the fishes. Braving seasickness to accompany him on inspection tours, paying hundreds of social calls, hostessing dinners almost every night. When she found herself pregnant again, she employed a social secretary to help her. Lucy Mercer, an attractive young woman with a sunny personality, soon became part of the Roosevelt household. And I mean, you all know this story, I think, which is a bit of a mystery. Why do you all know this story and not others? Because you haven't all read Ellen's excellent book, I believe. In the summer of 1918, Franklin sailed to Europe to inspect American naval operations on the front line. Oh, sorry, this is Hyde Park, where his mother lived and where they spent most weekends. And here is Franklin and Lucy Mercer. And here is Franklin with some Americans on Normandy, the beaches of Normandy in 1918. Look at his beautiful legs. So he sailed to Europe to inspect American naval operations on the front line. Eleanor stayed in Washington, working long shifts in a steaming hot Red Cross canteen that provided food for soldiers in transit. In mid-September, Franklin came home with double pneumonia and had to be carried off the ship on a stretcher. When Eleanor unpacked his suitcase, she discovered a stack of love letters from Lucy. Many biographers see this as a major turning point in the marriage, after which it never entirely recovered. I don't see it this way at all. We know very little about Franklin's romance with Lucy. We don't even know whether it was consummated. I talk about it in my book, and I'm certainly no Puritan. But, it was hard in those days. Lucy was 26 and Catholic. She lived with her mother. Franklin lived in a house full of servants. You did not go and check in at a hotel while your wife. It was tawdry. So, it would have been difficult. I rather think that they just sort of did some passionate necking, as we say, in the back of the car. Who knows? It's speculation. But anyway, we don't know. But much has been made of Lucy as the love of his life, and I think this is partly because Lucy happened to be among the group of people who were with him when he died in Warm Springs, and Eleanor was not. And so they say Lucy was with him and Eleanor was not. But Eleanor rarely went with Franklin when he was trying to relax. He wanted his cocktails, he wanted his banter, and Eleanor was a woman on the go. She had to be back in New York and Washington doing her job. She was a woman on the go. I don't want to idealize the marriage. Of course it was a shock for Eleanor to come across the love letters. But their bond was strong enough to transcend this crisis. Is it too hot in here? Are you all going to go to sleep? If I see you sleeping, I'll have to do what Haydn did in the Surprise Symphony. But their bond was strong enough to transcend this crisis. In the months after the Lucy Mercer affair, Franklin still called his wife Dearest Babs, and she called him Dearest Honey. But I think things were changing at that time, the end of the war. Eleanor had worked during the war and done a lot of war service. She liked it, felt good about it. And values were changing, particularly for women. This was, the beginning of the roaring 20s, les années folles. And, women now bobbed their hair and stopped wearing long dresses and started to smoke and started to have affairs because, after all, there were far fewer men that had all been killed at the front, so they had to share them a bit more generously. But for the moment, I often think that Eleanor would have been very interested in politics even if Franklin had not had that dreadful thing happen to him in 1921. But in June 1920, Franklin, at the age of 38, was nominated the Democratic Party for vice president. Francis Perkins, his future Secretary of Labour, described him at the Democratic Convention. Tall, strong, handsome and popular, he was one of the stars of the show. I recall how he displayed his athletic ability by vaulting over a row of chairs to get to the platform in a hurry. Eleanor joined Franklin on his campaign trip across the country. In those days you campaigned by train, really. You saw the Depression. This was 1920, not yet. It was almost certain that the Democrats would lose, and they did, but Franklin made a very positive impression on the national stage, and he was looking pretty good for standing next time as presidential candidate. In the meantime, he planned to run as governor of New York. In the summer of 1921, Franklin, for the first time in years, was planning to spend the whole summer at Campo Bello with his family. So the kids were aged 15 to 5. This isn't a very happy picture, but we won't put too much on the picture. People like to say it was because Eleanor had, was still getting over the Lucy Mercer thing 2 years before. It may have been that the sun was in their eyes, I don't know. But admittedly, they don't look too happy. They're on Campo Bello. This is the house on Campo Bello, which, just like Hyde Park and just like Warm Springs, you can see, and they're 3 fascinating Roosevelt houses, all worth visiting. So the 5 Roosevelt children were on Campo Bello. Louis Howe was there with his family, and Louis and Franklin, while they carved little wooden boats on the back porch overlooking the Bay of Fundy, made plans for Franklin's run as governor. Franklin, who was a restless man, was doing the usual sailing, running, swimming, camping with the kids. He was super athletic. And then came catastrophe of unimaginable proportions. I mean, just because Franklin and Eleanor had to play this down, polio. Again, people kind of play it down. It was awful. On August the 10th, Franklin went to bed, shivering and aching all over. By Friday, most of his body was paralyzed, actually up even to his face. This was 1921. Campo Bello was a remote island off the northern coast of Maine. You can see they had dangerous high tides. God knows why they bothered to go up there with 50 suitcases and the kids and endless trains and ferries to get up to this rather uninteresting island. It was a remote island. There were no helicopters to airlift him to a hospital. There was no bridge on which an ambulance could cross. The one telephone on the island at the small general store in Welshpool offered no privacy, and it would have caused panic on the island if Eleanor had described Franklin's condition on the phone. You know, the immense fear of polio. It was like the plague. The nearest doctor had to boat across the strait from Lubeck. He showed Eleanor, who had no training in nursing, how to insert a catheter with great care to avoid infection, and how to administer an enema. Franklin was paralyzed. By the time a polio specialist arrived on the island from Boston, Franklin had been lying in agony for 14 days, unable to move or turn, with Eleanor nursing him around the clock. It was polio, as they feared. 16 years into the marriage, Franklin, at the age of 39, had become a paraplegic and would always remain a paraplegic. That winter, back at 4749 East 65th Street, the household was in turmoil. Franklin, Eleanor, Mama, and the children were adjusting to these frightening new circumstances. Franklin had a valet, a strong black man, to lift him around and help him dress. Louis Howe moved into the house, leaving his family in Poughkeepsie. He went at weekends on the train. Meanwhile, he lived with the Roosevelts and took over Franklin's work in Franklin's name. Howe was an asthmatic. He smoked like a chimney, coughed all day, and wheezed all night. Mama couldn't stand him, that dirty little man, she called him. The children resented Louis Howe's authority in the house and were jealous of their mother's affection for him. Franklin was becoming very dependent on his live-in nurse, a pretty young woman with a bubbling sense of humor. Above all, a titanic power struggle was taking place between the women of the house. Mama wanted Franklin to retreat to Hyde Park in a wheelchair where she would look after him and give him handouts of money and dominate him. Her kind of love was very possessive. And Eleanor, who understood that this would destroy Franklin's spirit, encouraged him to practice walking on crutches, which was extremely painful. His legs were useless. So in order to walk on crutches, he had to wear 10-pound braces on each leg. You see how he painted the bottom black? They were heavy, clanking, they hurt him. He hated them. He hated practicing walking, as he called it, but he wasn't walking at all. Eleanor kept pushing him, and to keep up his work and political interests. Franklin's nurse and physiotherapist both felt, just like Mama did, that Eleanor was pushing him too hard. Eleanor was always accused of pushing Franklin too hard. In later years, Franklin's doctors would agree that Franklin's mental rehabilitation owed a great deal to Eleanor. After a year, Franklin's nurse departed, leaving a void in Franklin's life, which was gradually filled by his young secretary from Boston, a modest working-class girl from a Catholic from Boston, Marguerite Lahand. The children called her Missy, and the name stuck. In the winter of 1923, after 18 months in which Franklin had been largely confined to his homes in New York and Hyde Park, you can imagine how hard that was. His first excursion out of the New York house was by cover of night, because Louis Howe insisted that nobody must see him with his, nobody must know about the extent of his polio. They carefully manipulated the press. So Franklin, after 18 months, headed south with Missy, his valet, and a group of friends who came and went to spend 6 weeks on a rented houseboat in the waters off Florida, cruising, fishing, and swimming. For the next 7 years, it was the water which enabled Franklin to find his way back to life. The following winter, he bought an old houseboat, the Loroco. Soon after, he discovered Warm Springs, Georgia, a rundown resort spa with a warm, open-air pool fed by a natural spring. He used to hope, because somebody had... that's Missy Lahand. He used to hope that he'd be able to walk again if he swam. But what he did do was build up his upper body strength, as you saw. From 1924 to 1928, Franklin was away more often than he was home. He spent most of his time in the South with Missy. Eleanor understood, and I think this is remarkably generous, that Franklin needed to get away from family tensions, his mother's solicitude, and her own pushing. She also understood that however grueling the physical struggle, Franklin's main struggle was psychological. Her restless, ambitious husband faced the supreme challenge of remaking his life. If his adoring secretary Missy could help him feel like a man again, Eleanor was not going to complain. We don't know. We certainly know they had a romance. We know that Missy was deeply in love with Franklin. We don't know what else they got up to. Franklin was capable, if you want to know, of... So maybe, I rather hope he did, to, Meanwhile, back in New York, Louis Howe encouraged Eleanor to enter the political fray herself. Not only was it important that women played an active role, he told her, but it was the best way to keep politics alive in the Roosevelt household and the family name in front of the public. Eleanor found the political domain thrilling. She had the organizational skills, commitment, and charisma to make her remarkably good at it. In no time, she became the leading figure in the women's division of the New York State Democratic Committee. Women now had the vote. The women's vote was extremely important to the Democratic Party, which Franklin and Louis Howe both realized. These were the new friends Eleanor was making, no longer the tea ladies, society ladies in long dresses, but educated women, which Eleanor was not. She had a very rough schooling. These were political activists, some of whom with their short hair, cigarette holders, and knickerbockers looked like dapper young men. Behind Eleanor's back, cousin Alice called them female impersonators. Franklin's half-brother Rosie referred to them as Eleanor's parlor pinks. Even Franklin and Louis Howe, who respected them a great deal, jokingly called them she-males. Eleanor had grown particularly close to Nancy Cook, who is on her, second to left in the photo, and Marion Dickerman, who were a lesbian couple. It is interesting that lesbians did play a very important role in Eleanor's life. Franklin enjoyed their company. They thought he was the most charming man they'd ever met. And it was Franklin one evening at a picnic who had the idea that they should build a house. And that, because after all, Eleanor was 40 now, and she was tired of living in New York with Mama and at Hyde Park in Mama's house, having to ask Mama if she could have guests. As she was becoming more and more political, and so and especially with Franklin away, and they were having rows, Mama and she, from now on. So, or at least Eleanor was standing up to her much more bravely. So this was Franklin's idea, called Val-Kill. When you go up to the FDR Museum, you'll see it. And Franklin designed the stone cottage. Mama was not happy about it at all. With this house of her own, Eleanor had issued an unambiguous declaration of independence. Franklin called it the love nest and honeymoon cottage. He was taking a subversive delight in Eleanor's new life. Meanwhile, by the way, he'd set up a community. This became a place which was, at weekends, the hub of the women's democratic. I mean, there were always people visiting. They put out newspapers. It was a very lively scene. Meanwhile, down in Warm Springs, Franklin had invested 2/3 of his money to help other polios, as he called them. No sooner did he like Warm Springs himself than he had the idea of setting up a community. It was very grim to be a cripple in those days. In these austere institutions, to do the exercises you had to do as a polio, as they called themselves, were really painful. So Franklin had the idea that they would be together in Warm Springs and they'd encourage each other and they'd sit after their exercises on the porch together and enjoy talking and have a lovely dinner with white tablecloths and Negro servants, as they called them at the time, because this was the South. And, this was in fact, the most friendly, avant-garde place in America. And Franklin found the money for these people. He found benefactors. This was not a private institution. Polios didn't have much money. So now, 20 years into their marriage, halfway through, because it was a 40-year marriage, in March 1925, 4 years after polio had changed their lives, Franklin and Eleanor celebrated their 20th wedding anniversary on the Loroco with the gang. And although those on board might not have thought so at the time, there was good reason for celebration. The Roosevelts had achieved something rare. Their marriage was as strong as ever, and yet they had broken free from its traditional confines. By now it was clear to all their friends that Franklin and Eleanor were no longer a traditional couple. They also had independent lives which involved other close companions. It was a daring direction to go in, particularly for Franklin, who already had an uphill battle with his image as a paraplegic. But polio had convinced him more than ever of the virtues of communal life. He needed people to come to him. He didn't want to be dependent on one person, but more, and he wanted reciprocity. He wanted to do things for them, and he was very good, just as he was when he was president, at giving people the opportunity to do what they did best. Eleanor was best in New York, doing her thing. Missy LeHand was terrific in the South with him, putting up with the mosquitoes and his fishing rod and his prohibition cocktails. Eleanor hated that whole scene. And Louis Howe was brilliant at working behind the scenes on the telephone. Here they are in the swimming pool at Val-Kill. You can see how Franklin's legs are shrunken. Missy LeHand in the middle, Eleanor on the right. Eleanor, too, had grown much bolder since Franklin's polio. Courage is more exhilarating than fear, she told friends, and in the long run it is easier. They needed their courage. Franklin hadn't recovered any of his mobility. Missy would later confide to a friend, there were days on the houseboat when it was noon before he could pull himself out of depression and greet his guests wearing his light-hearted facade. Franklin, naturally, constantly worried that his political ambitions were delusional. Back in New York, Louis Howe and Eleanor were pushing him, but how could he possibly run for office when he couldn't even walk, let alone stand? So he talked twice in those 7 years, which he used to call the wilderness years. The first time on crutches with the braces, and the press hailed him as a hero. The second time at the 1928 Democratic National Convention in Houston, Franklin was determined that the public see him as being back on his feet. He couldn't walk, he couldn't stand, but with 10-pound braces on each leg, a cane in his right arm, a strong son holding his left arm, and such powerful upper body strength that he was able to swing himself forward from his hips, he looked as if he were walking. His physiotherapist deplored this method of ambulation. If he fell, he would crash like a tree. But Franklin was determined. Down in Warm Springs, he and his son Elliot practiced for weeks, while Franklin jerked himself forward, beads of sweat dripping off his brow, and Elliot suffering bruises from his father's steel grip on his arm. They worked up a routine of bantering and laughter to distract onlookers. From New York, Eleanor wrote to Franklin, I'm telling everyone you're going to Houston without crutches, so mind you stick at it. Their determination, as well as their deliberate deceit, it has to be said, resulted in a spectacular triumph. In November 1928, Franklin Delano Roosevelt was elected governor of New York. Here they are, governor of New York and wife. I think he was as clever as Oprah Winfrey at sort of knowing how to do the fire, the dog, the Christmas cards. The braces were airbrushed out if he was wearing them. You wouldn't guess that he couldn't walk. Eleanor, who had become extremely wary of being subsumed by her role as wife, decided that she would be mistress of the governor's mansion in Albany for 4 days a week, and on the other 3 days she would continue with her teaching. She did some teaching with Nancy and Marion, and political work in Manhattan. Her political activity would now have to be more covert. I mean, when she was governor's wife, she could do the overt stuff. Back in New York, working in the Women's Democratic Division, her name had to be taken off the Women's Democratic News and so on, but she was doing a brilliant job behind the scenes at getting the women's vote. Franklin agreed to this. Missy acted as hostess at the governor's dinner table when Eleanor was away in New York. She had a room just down the corridor from FDR. There was plenty of gossip about the goings-on in the governor's mansion. Eleanor was also seen to be very close to her bodyguard, Earl Miller. And, but, you know, there was, by the way, nothing going on, in my opinion. He was devoted to her. He called her lady, and they went around the state together on inspection tours, acting as Franklin's eyes and legs. He was the one who told her that she had a beautiful smile, and that, you know, rather than always covering up her jawline, she should smile. And from now on, she smiled. Franklin in Warm Springs as governor with his entourage, Missy LeHand doling out sandwiches. Here we have Eleanor and her bodyguard, Earl Miller. And you see that if Eleanor had a problem with her self-image, he did not. As governor of New York, it's a fascinating photo, isn't it? As governor of New York during the Depression, FDR showed himself to be a confirmed liberal with the courage to take on the entrenched conservatives in upstate New York. From his office in the executive mansion, he used the new medium of radio to get his ideas out directly to the people, which was just as well because then, as now, the press was 80% owned by William Randolph Hearst, Republican. So if he talked on the radio, he could at least get out his ideas himself. Eleanor attended political functions, presided over receptions, wrote magazine articles, gave talks, maintained a vast correspondence, and then did her work behind the scenes. A New Yorker journalist wrote of her, no woman has a better grasp of the intricacies of state business. Louis Howe, behind the scenes. Franklin's second term of governor of New York, it was quite clear that he was going to stand for the presidential candidate in 1932. In June 1932, FDR was nominated as the Democratic Party's presidential candidate. In November 1932, FDR romped in as President of the United States, a paraplegic. Here they are, a whistle stop. Eleanor was essential to him because women had the vote now, and if she didn't appear with him, the crowds shouted for her. That's Earl Miller in the background. You see how he had to prop himself up with the rail and with Eleanor's hand and always look as if it was easy. Quite often they airbrushed the photos so that really he looks as if he's standing, and he certainly isn't. You can see that Eleanor was not ugly. When she was in her evening dresses with that radiant smile in her handbag, she was at a women's event here, Democratic women's event. She looked absolutely elegant. This is a little cruel of me. This was, Earl Miller had now married again. It's fascinating, the Lorena Hickok story. You'll read about it, I hope. When Eleanor and Franklin were campaigning in 1932 on the campaign train, of course, the press car was a few cars back on the train. And in it, the most prominent woman political journalist in the country was Lorena Hickok, a very bright woman. She's not at her best here. And so it's Eleanor who took this photo, but I shouldn't really have done this. But Lorena Hickok, everyone called her Hick, was the nation's, as I said, foremost political journalist. Originally from South Dakota, Hick strode around like a hard-boiled newspaper man, smoked like a chimney, and had a deep sympathy for the working people. It was Hick's view that America was in trouble, it was now the Depression, and they needed a first lady who made use of her position to speak out. So, I mean, another of the myths that I completely debunk is that in her autobiography, the first 2 volumes of which Eleanor wrote while in the White House, no First Lady had ever done that, Eleanor writes that she was deeply troubled by the prospect of being First Lady. It's absurd, this myth, perpetrated by Eleanor and credulously swallowed ever since. Eleanor had always done and would always do everything in her power to help Franklin fulfill his political dreams. She genuinely believed that if anyone could pull the country out of the Depression, it was FDR, and she believed she had a role to play. She'd never really had a private life anyway. She'd had servants, she'd had a mother-in-law, she was governor's wife. But she said that because she had to, you had to say you never tried to influence your husband, you weren't very interested in politics, because already Franklin was constantly accused by the Hearst press of a petticoat government, with Eleanor wearing the trousers. So in a way she was answering the criticism. So interestingly, you see, this romance was at its height in the 4 months, it was 4 months in those days between the election, the lame duck period, the election and the inauguration in March. So during those 4 months, Eleanor and Lorena Hickok were having an absolutely tempestuous affair. And then, and there are thousands of letters which have survived, and even though the most intimate have apparently been destroyed, there are plenty of sentences left in the lesser intimate letters which make it quite clear that it was a physical relationship and extremely tender. I'm not saying that Eleanor was a lesbian, but she had a lesbian relationship. Generally, she rather fell in love with handsome young men. It was Hick was very encouraging to Eleanor to speak out. And in the summer of 1933, poor Hick was obliged to resign from her big deal job at the Associated Press. By now, she was known throughout the nation as a personal friend of Eleanor's, and for a political journalist, this was disastrous. So what she did was find a job with the Federal Emergency Relief Administration, FERA, a New Deal program, which involved travelling around the country, reporting back on socio-economic conditions in different regions. And, so I'm trying to make the point that Franklin and Eleanor were aristocrats in the White House who were more in touch with the common people than almost any president. Not only were they talking regularly to Harry Hopkins, Harold Akers, and, Hick was writing Eleanor reports which she read to Franklin, but also letters. One evening, just to give you an idea, in a shabby hotel room in Baltimore, Hick read in the newspapers that Eleanor had given a speech in New York in a blue velvet gown. God damn it, she fumed in her nightly letter to Eleanor. None of us ought to be wearing velvet dinner gowns these days, not when 4,000 Baltimore children couldn't go to school in September because they didn't have clothes. She ended the letter more calmly. I must get to work on my notes. Darling, in a blue velvet dinner gown or out of it, I love you. In between her travels, Hick lived at the White House, sleeping in Eleanor's private suite and eating with Eleanor's official guests. This was fine with Franklin. He liked her a lot. Meanwhile, the White House publicity staff carefully snipped Hick out of the official photos. I want to read you just a short passage, very short passage, just to give you a sense of, and I'm nearly finished, of the atmosphere in the White House. With the Roosevelts in residence, the White House was full of laughter and vitality. You know how it was when Uncle Ted was there, how gay and homelike FDR had told his relatives at the inauguration dinner. Well, that's how we mean to have it. Those relatives who came to the inauguration dinner in March 1933, there were 80 of them. Every single one of them had voted Republican. I think he should have fed them poison. Franklin and Eleanor enjoyed communal living. Neither of them liked to be alone, and they rarely were. They felt happiest when surrounded by talk, laughter, work, activity. They liked to have friends sleeping across the hallway who wandered into their bedrooms in pajamas to discuss urgent matters. Life in the White House suited the Roosevelts to a T. Every morning at 9 a.m. after FDR had finished his breakfast, Missy and Louis Howe would find him sitting up in his narrow bed wearing an old sweater, surrounded by newspapers, inserting another cigarette into his cigarette holder. His other two secretaries, Steve Early and Marvin McIntyre, would turn up for their daily bedside briefing. FDR was perfectly capable of talking to passing visitors while he was in the bathroom shaving. "Take a seat on the can," he would tell them cheerily. He would happily continue their discussion while his valet helped him dress. FDR was not inhibited. Neither of them were. Missy LeHand lived in a sunny little suite on the 3rd floor, the walls of which were covered with photographs of FDR, Eleanor, and the Roosevelt children. Louis Howe lived on the 2nd floor in the Lincoln Room across the West Hall from Eleanor. Like Eleanor, he had made the large room into his study and slept in the small dressing room just off it. And then I jump a bit. They often had dinner guests, and more formal dinners were carefully stage-managed. Eleanor came late to cocktails, then distracted the guests, chatting about the portraits on the walls until Franklin had been wheeled into the dining room and transferred from his wheelchair to his seat at the end of the table. As the group walked in, he would welcome them with his big grin. "It's strange to say now," one visitor commented after Franklin's death, "but you didn't really notice he couldn't walk. He was a sort of Mount Rushmore being wheeled around, and all you noticed after a while was the Mount Rushmore part." It is amazing when you think of it that the press was complicit in this, and even the Republican cameramen dropped their cameras when Franklin was carried into the car and so on. Before television, but there were newsreels, but Franklin was nearly always shown at the podium. He'd got there. And, he had to make sure the podium would support him. He was wearing braces, and he gesticulated a lot with his head to make up for the fact that he couldn't take his arms off. And he was such an eloquent speaker but I have seen, there are 3 photos of Roosevelt in a wheelchair. It was almost never, it's amazing that they have survived. His press secretary was absolutely censorious. And what else did I want to say? By the way, it's funny, though, that when the King and Queen came here in 1939, the Stuttering King, you've just seen the film, they had a picnic, the hot dog picnic, and then they went to Valkill, you saw the swimming pool, and Franklin got in with the King. He was uninhibited about his shrunken legs. Eleanor and the Queen sat on the side. The Queen was sort of fanning herself in the heat and saying, we had no idea that Franklin couldn't walk. So, on the one hand, it was a big cover-up, but on the other hand, they didn't entirely cover up. It was a really extraordinary thing. So I'm not going to talk much about the war. I'm going to let you read the book, but I'll just finish off with saying in their public and private lives, Franklin and Eleanor were idealistic, energetic, hard-working, and deeply democratic. During World War II, FDR became the Allies' chief planner, strategic initiator, and main source of authority. Eleanor was at her best when FDR sent her abroad as a goodwill ambassador to war-torn England in 1942 and to the South Pacific in 1943. Do you recognize her? Missy LeHand in the White House. Eleanor with Eleanor Morgenthau, wife of the treasurer, Henry Morgenthau. They had friends who were Jewish, they had friends who were Catholic, they had friends who were blacks, many friends who were working class. That was their first summer back in 1933 when Franklin, for the first time in 12 years, went back to Campo Bello. You see the boys, and you see Marion and Nancy, the gang. One of the rare photos of Franklin in a wheelchair. Eleanor now in 1942 in England, towering over the diminutive king and queen, wearing a rather unfortunate fox thing. I'm glad we can't see the eyeballs. And this is how she's known in Australia. They were crying in Australia, they were crying in South America, they were crying in France the day FDR died, April 1945. He and Eleanor were the people the whole world looked to. The Australians loved her because she turned up in a little Red Cross uniform and a peak hat and 2 little suitcases and in a horrible cold army plane and worked like you wouldn't believe. So Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt were viewed throughout the world as embodying the best of the American character. There were plenty of tragedies during those years. Louis Howe died. Missy LeHand died. The Roosevelt marriage had its trials. Franklin was something of a flirt. He liked to be adored. Hardly surprising for a man with his golden childhood who was doted on by his mother, an incredibly physical man who had to find his sense of manhood again after being crippled. Eleanor was insecure with a voracious need to be loved. Hardly surprising for a woman with her tragic childhood who sensed that her mother never loved her and whose parents were both dead before she was 10. And as I said to you, even as First Lady, Eleanor always felt like the ugly duckling, the orphan, the girl who deserved love only if she were good. Eleanor expected a great deal from Franklin, and he expected a great deal from her. when it came to relaxation, they preferred to be with others. I mean, Eleanor liked to talk politics, and Franklin liked to relax. He had the burden of the war on his back. And everybody says they were apart so much, it shows that it was a lousy marriage. I think this is extraordinary. They were different people who had different needs. And I don't see that at all. But FDR, what was I going to say? Eleanor she knew he was dying in that last year. He looked so terrible. He died at 62. But she took the view, that our boys were dying on the battlefields and we had a job to do. And Franklin was, in his 4th term as president. And if he went down dying, so be it. I mean, he couldn't go down relaxing. His friends were all critical of her again for pushing him. But she just took the view, you're president, Franklin, we've got to do this. And really, she was right. But that's why he preferred to be with others when he needed to relax, and why he was down in Warm Springs without her. And they rather ganged up on Eleanor, the Franklin acolytes, saying, she pushed him too much, but he was president. FDR, the man at the helm, knew what he owed to Eleanor. Far more than the woman behind the scenes, she was the woman on the scene. The woman the press liked to joke was ubiquitous. Eleanor Roosevelt couldn't have been the woman she was without Franklin, but nor could Franklin Roosevelt have been the woman he was without Eleanor. Together they made possible what to most people would have seemed impossible. Eleanor Roosevelt once said, you must do the things you think you cannot do. She did. FDR did. As a couple, they both did. Here they are. Here he is at Yalta looking sick. This is his house in Warm Springs. But first he lived in very, very modest cottages, and finally he built what they called the Little White House in Warm Springs, which is also modest. This is Lucy Mercer again, I think the day before he died. This is the scene in Warm Springs. Franklin followed and preceded by Secret Service. Sitting in the back, he could no longer drive, with a chauffeur, and 2 friends, Daisy Suckley and Laura, his cousin, Laura Delano. And the sad picture, Eleanor at his funeral, April 1945 at Hyde Park with Charles de Gaulle. Okay, thank you. Bunged on a bit, but if we have questions, we have some time, I think. Yes?
Franklin's romantic relationships, extramarital relationships, you said that he had one clearly with Missy. I wasn't clear what you concluded about Lucy Mercer, and also were there others?
Well, this is one of the big things about what people do, even with my book, that they tend to pretend that it was all sort of sexual escapades. Franklin had polio. He may or may not have had an affair with Lucy in his pre-polio days. And he saw her again later in his life when her own husband died. And that's, I think he reminded her of his pre-polio days, and she was a warm friend. But I also have evidence that he complained about her a bit. She used to make a lot of demands. She was always asking for him to do things for his nephew, for her son, for her this, for her that, for her husband's son. So Lucy, definitely not after polio, no way. Missy may be in those 7 years in the South, I think. A man with polio writes that he thinks it's very improbable because it's so difficult for a proud man to show his vulnerability with a woman. But I think Franklin probably did with Missy. She was so very patient and kind, and Franklin was a very physical man. But there's no way there was anybody else. All these other women were just, devoted to him, and he liked to flirt. And Eleanor, the bodyguard, etc., no way, in my opinion. There was definitely a physical relationship for a short time with Lorena Hickok. Otherwise, she made a habit of falling in love with people who already had partners, which made it safe. The young Joseph Lash, who was, always telling her about the difficulties of his relationship with Trude Lash, and so on. So Eleanor was more motherly and needed love, but, they were not bopping into bed with people. This is ridiculous. Yes, he did. He was, first of all, Eleanor's very close friend during the New Deal days, and then during the war he became Franklin's closest friend because he was very good at war negotiations. And Eleanor was a bit jealous of that because Franklin, during the war, was always behind closed doors, in the map room, plotting things. And even though she played the role as being backdoor to the president, during the war it was frustrating for her. Civil rights were put on ice and so on. So, but she did her best. She was very good as ambassador, but certainly she was frustrated. She felt a bit left out. She was no good. She was not interested in the war. I mean, she was the one who bent over all the wounded soldiers and saw exactly what the war was doing. She hated it. And her own sons, their own sons, were fighting, all of them. It was a very real possibility that, they would be killed.
Did you have the opportunity to speak to any of the Roosevelt family?
Well, this is the first book I've written that I didn't do any interviews because they're a generation back from all my previous books, and for the first time there was nobody alive who knew them intimately. And the grandchildren, who knew them a little bit, they weren't going to know anything. So I read vast quantities of letters. I was very conscious of two things. I did not want to repeat the same time-worn stories that have been repeated time and again without any evidence. So there had to be evidence. And secondly, I was going to read intelligently between the lines after, writing a number of books. If Eleanor said I wasn't interested in politics, and I found endless letters where she's writing to Harold Ickes and Harry Hopkins, is it true that the Negro division isn't given equal pay? Can you look into this? And so on and so on and so on. It goes on and on. I read between the lines and didn't take anybody's word for it. Yeah. It was Eleanor who suggested to Franklin that he elect Frances Perkins as the first woman cabinet minister ever in American history. And it was remarkably daring because to be Secretary of Labour for a woman was very strange. She had to deal with all these, very male trade union things. She was a true progressive, a wonderful woman who really did bring in the 1935 Social Security Bill. But Franklin, who sort of made out with Francis that he was the daring one, they both grinned at each other, and both of them knew really that it came from Eleanor. But, what I'm saying is that Franklin had the boldness to give Eleanor license to do what she wanted. There were people around Franklin who absolutely wanted the First Lady to shut up. She was having weekly press conferences with women. She insisted there should be no men because women journalists had a very rough trot back in those days. She had a My Day column, which was syndicated even in the Republican papers. It became very, very popular. It was really Eleanor's chance to show the president and his family in a very warm light and show her in a warm family light. She was brilliant. I mean, she played a huge role. And so, yeah.
Would you comment about their views of their children and the upbringing and so forth, and how that played into their relationship?
Their view of their children, they definitely were not good parents. But, that's often the case, isn't it, that busy people are not good parents. And but I think we also have to bear in mind that the baby manuals of the time were telling women that if your child sucked his thumb, you had to tie his arms by his side, and that you should hang your baby out on a fresh air crib outside the window for a few hours every day. She did as she was told, and the neighbour complained that this was cruel. And then, of course, aristocracy, just like the British aristocracy, they sent their kids to Groton at the age of 12. These poor little kids had to, be taken up on the train to Groton and left in the New England wilderness where they learnt to be leaders in the toughest possible way. So it wasn't fun, really, was it? I mean, in that time. They weren't alone. But definitely, Franklin, let's look at Franklin and not just accuse Eleanor of being a bad mother. Franklin was away so often after polio. He was away so often before polio being a political man. And once he was, governor and president, you can imagine the kids had to make an appointment with him. He was a busy, busy man. Yes?
Did you feel that most of the research material you were using for the book was located at Hyde Park? Did you find much in Washington?
Hyde Park has most of it. Even the Washington stuff they have copied. And I saw footage, audiovisual footage and so on, which was very interesting. I did see some footage of Franklin walking, which is very rare. He's walking into the Rhinebeck post office. And my God, even though I had read so much about Franklin and his walking, I was horrified to see this. It was so slow, so agonizing. People could not have seen that. We cannot underestimate what Franklin's... I mean, when you think about how he managed to be president and had to be constantly whisked to places and hidden, and, and it was extraordinary, really. Carried like a child up and down stairs and into cars, and no record of it. Yes, his press secretary, Stephen Early, was extremely strict with reporters. But they did consent. I think there was more dignity in those days toward handicapped people. You had a question?
Yes, you mentioned earlier in your talk that your views on Lucy were a little different than
Ellen's.
Could you expand on that?
Well, Ellen has written this brilliant novel, which is extremely clever, like she did in Scottsboro, which is getting into a very enigmatic figure. I mean, mostly the letters between Lucy Mercer and Franklin were destroyed. There are just a few notes left. And so she had to try and find what she could and imagine and speculate. And as I said to you, I was completely taken by the book and somewhat hooked, and it took me a long time to stop writing point of view stuff because I couldn't do that. But my view finally was that, yes, I think, you see, even the sons were paid money by the Chicago Playboy Press to write stuff about their parents. And they would be paid more money if they managed to scoop the dirt. And so they James, I think it was it? Came up with the idea of a motel, that there's a record that Lucy and Roosevelt checked into a motel. There were no motels back then. And there's no record anyway. But, the Sun said this, so this story was also taken up. So I was just very careful to check for evidence. And I do think, I don't know why do people even today want to portray Franklin and Eleanor as a bit tawdry even? And they patronize them, they talk about them disparagingly. How can they, given what they achieved? And why do we have to pretend they were always getting into bed with people? They had close companions who helped them in their political mission. They needed help. He had polio. Eleanor had to hold the fort. So I'm, in my book, making a lot of emphasis on community, a loving community. There were tensions, let me not, idealize things, but so I don't take the Lucy line as being the big love of Franklin's life. Certainly if he had been married to Lucy, he would not have had 4 terms in the White House. Eleanor was brilliant. One last question, I think, perhaps? Yes? Oh, they did rather, yes. Especially some of them. Not so much Anna, the oldest, the only girl, but the 4 sons. There were 6 children. 1 died at 10 months, so there were 5. The sons, they tended to adore their father and be hard on Eleanor. They said she was, no fun and austere. And she did have this rather unfortunate habit of choosing other young people she preferred to be with than them. And this would have made any kids jealous. So it was hard on the kids, there's no doubt. Okay, thank you very much.